Kirill Kaprizov signed the richest contract in the history of the salary cap era today. The Edmonton Oilers might be in trouble.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This will be my fourth season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day. And today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win up to $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to talk about what the Kirill Kaprizov extension means for the Edmonton Oilers and Connor McDavid. And this might be apples to oranges for some of you out there. You might be a bit more skeptical of the impact Kaprizov's decision has on McDavid. But I do think anytime a superstar player signs, that does something in a sport, especially in a sport like the NHL, where the salary cap has loomed so large over a lot of the last 10 to 15 years. So to start out, we will talk about that Kaprizov extension and what it means for right now. We will talk about it in relation to Kaprizov, the Wild, and the economics of the NHL. Our second segment, we will pivot to what this says about where we are going as far as star contracts. And then in our final segment, we will tie a bow all together talking about what this means for the Oilers. So to start out, and I have been very upfront about this for a while now, whenever you are a star player, arguably the best in the world, one of the best in the world, anytime you get to free agency or have the prospect of getting to free agency, you take on an additional responsibility beyond yourself. And this is a very labor-centric opinion, a worker-centric opinion. And I know that mindset might escape some listeners because we're talking about tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. But the fact that Kaprizov went into this negotiation, got the highest possible number he could, and reset the market value for players league-wide, that helps every other player in the NHL. Now, it is worth, and we will talk about it in our second and third segments, about, well, what about the Sidney Crosbys of the world, the Patrice Bergerons of the world, the Zdeno Charas of the world, the guys who intentionally leave money on the table so their team can fill out the rest of their lineup? There's nothing wrong with that. But I am saying, if you want to take the most labor-centric view of your negotiations, especially as a marquee, a superstar player, getting as much value as you possibly can has a trickle-down effect for every other player. Other guys are going to make more money now because of what Kaprizov was able to negotiate. I do think some of the circumstances, in particular to Kaprizov and the Wild, make this perhaps a bit unique. And when we are talking about non-traditional hockey markets, and to be fair, Minnesota is a hockey hotbed, but I am talking about it in the perspective of market size. I am talking about it in terms of drawing power, because as we know, the NHL is a gate-driven league. Ticket sales still reign supreme. That is why the balances of power are still in Toronto. They're still in New York to some degree. They're still in Boston. Why Vegas has been able to arrive as splashily as they have in the last 7 years. When you have that guarantee, and look, I understand revenue sharing means everybody gets equal cuts of the pie, what have you, but those centralized market powers make it difficult for smaller market teams to keep star talent. We know that for a fact. It is difficult for small market teams to keep their big fish. You know, Matthew Tkachuk probably being the most famous one, a player leveraging 2 full years away from unrestricted free agency into exactly where he wanted to go and signing a contract as part of that trade. You know, Matthew Tkachuk is technically the first sign and trade in the history of the NHL. And that's an example of a superstar player wanting that greener grass, wanting those bigger pastures. And I know Florida doesn't necessarily profile as either a traditional hockey market or, frankly, a major market, but The Panthers, by virtue of the success they've had over the last 2 years, have manufactured themselves into one of those teams and have become a desirable landing spot. So when you're the Wild, when you're Bill Guerin, you are looking at this Kaprizov situation and saying, if he leaves, I'm cooked. And I was very adamant about this. I think I said this last week on Locked On NHL with Hunter Hodes, or maybe 2 weeks ago. If Bill Guerin couldn't agree to a Kaprizov extension, the Wild were effectively going to have to start over. And I know that sounds a bit hyperbolic. Some of their existing core is pretty good. I love Matt Boldy. He's fun. Brock Faber should bounce back. Zook's still kicking. Eric Sinek, Ryan Hartman, the prospects they've called up the last 2 months of the season last year and into the playoffs. They have a decent team. With a healthy Kirill Kaprizov, that's a team that can make a conference final if things break right for them, maybe even make a Stanley Cup final. Without Kaprizov, who is by far their most dynamic player, one of the most dynamic players in the entire world, the outlook of that organization has a significantly lower trajectory. That team has a significantly lower ceiling. And that puts the Wild and it puts Bill Guerin in an awkward position where, because he knows that without Kaprizov, he is in trouble as far as the trajectory of the team, he has to go above and beyond. He has to make an offer that might be a bit more expensive than it might need to be if it were another team. And I don't begrudge Kaprizov in the slightest for getting as much money as he possibly could. He likes it in Minnesota enough to agree to stay there the next 8 years. Good for him. But this deal happens because the Wild know you need these superstar players. And the most textbook example of this I can think of is the deal Zach Werenski got from the Columbus Blue Jackets a couple years ago. The deal Ivan Provorov got from the Blue Jackets this past summer. That is a smaller market team that understands if it wants to keep marquee players, it's probably going to need to pay market value or better to get them to come. And I do think that presents challenges as far as team building goes. Can the Wild sustain a contender paying one player 16% of the salary cap? Sorry, I'm looking at my notes over there. And the other part of this, and it'll pivot nicely into what we're going to talk about in our next segment as far as the bigger picture of the macroeconomic trends of the league. When you are a team that has traditionally been a smaller market, that hasn't been able to be a player for major pieces or be able to acquire that marquee superstar player. And look, I know the Wild, they went in on Zach Parise and Ryan Suter last decade. Those were significant financial commitments. And I'm not here to make light of that, but those two guys combined are making less than what Kaprizov is going to make on this deal. So we're talking about different levels to spending here. And this matters on a league-wide scale because this tells the Utah hockey clubs of the world, maybe the Calgary Flames of the world, those smaller secondary or maybe even third-tier markets, that everybody's going to have money in the system now. Because of the salary cap finally catching up to revenues after dealing with COVID payoffs for a while, everybody's going to have liquidity now. Money alone is only half the battle. Now, I think money ultimately reigns supreme in a lot of these cases. I do think you might see a bit of a cultural difference emerge between the European players who feel a bit more of a familial responsibility to take care of the people in their life, taking these long-term deals the way Kaprizov did, whereas we might see the North American guys gamble on themselves a little bit more, looking at 2, 3, 4-year deal market range. That way you can reset your price again in 3 or 4 years and you go shorter term, you make more money. But everybody's going to have money now. And I'm not sure the NHL at large is ready for what that means if every team can afford to keep their superstars. But we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to tell you why the NHL is not ready for this level of liquidity in the system right after this. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's where our friends at Monarch Money come in. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances or the idea of getting it in line makes you anxious, Monarch is here for you. Monarch Money does all of the heavy lifting. You can link your accounts in minutes, see clear data visualizations, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money, and you will never, ever touch a spreadsheet. Monarch made me aware I wasn't saving as much as I needed to, both for my long-term plans, like maybe being able to retire someday, and for smaller things like headphones or a vacation. Monarch helps me put my goals into an actionable plan, put money aside, and pay things off without needing to finance them. Do not let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year subscription. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are breaking down what the Kirill Kaprizov extension means for the Oilers and the NHL at large. So if you're wondering why I keep looking over here, I started doing the legal pad instead of the iPad. I feel for some reason writing on paper makes my brain focus a little bit more, makes me feel like I've retained what I've written down a little bit more. So I do apologize if you're watching over on YouTube and wondering why I keep glancing off to the right there. But continuing along this thread, the NHL at large has largely been a capital market where money has been at a premium. Money has more value when there's less of it to go around. Players are worth more because there's less money to go around. When marquee, really good, not elite, but really good players can barely scratch $6.5–7 million per year, that's telling you the market is lagging far behind where it could be. And I have been very adamant that the owner's unwillingness to maybe be a bit more permissive or a bit more forgiving as far as that COVID debt went that the players owed them held them back. Because you think about where we're at now, where Kaprizov's going to make $17 million per year on this deal, and that'll kick in the fall of 2026 into 2027. We probably should have had this happen a while ago. You think about where Nathan McKinnon's at, his number, where Draisaitl, the contract he signed last summer. If we had just simply kept going at our rate, which was $4 or $5 million a year over the last 4 or 5 years, but we were at 81.5 for a while. And you think about, well, if we're at 85 or at 89, we should be north of $100 million salary cap already. And we're going to get there next year if everything goes according to plan revenue wise. But with everybody having more money in the system, it's going to be easier than ever for teams to keep the guys they do have. And because there's more money in the system, that money is worth less. That is why players are getting more. That is why Kaprizov is getting $17 million per year, because the Wild can afford to do that because money in the NHL system is worth less now because there is more capital available to all of these teams because the salary cap is going up. The value of that labor is being inflated. And I know we don't often talk about the market factors that drive these prices, but I genuinely don't think the decision makers in the NHL are ready for this. And I think next summer is going to be a watershed moment. The NBA had this 10 years ago. The summer Kevin Durant signed with the Warriors, the salary cap went up almost $30 million in one offseason because of the new TV deal. That led to ludicrous contracts like the one Harrison Barnes signed with the Kings, the one that Timothy Mozgov and Luol Deng signed with the Lakers, where decent players were dramatically overpaid because there was more money to throw around. When you have more money to throw around, you're not as diligent, you're not as meticulous. And there are big examples of that, like the ones I just listed in the NBA. And then there are smaller ones. You know, the one I harped on a lot last summer, and obviously not on the same scale, but giving Corey Perry like a $400,000 raise, giving Connor Brown a raise, giving Janmark a raise, giving guys raises more than they are worth purely because you have the capital to go around to try and entice them to stay It's not the best practice because that money adds up very, very quickly. And I know when we're talking about millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, an extra 200, 300 grand doesn't seem like that much, but you give an extra 300, 400 grand to 3 or 4 guys. Well, that's the difference between a good fourth liner and a replacement level fourth liner, which doesn't seem like a lot. But when you're operating on the margins, the way a team like the Oilers are, where they need every last dollar because they are in Stanley Cup contention, it becomes more challenging. And the reason I say the NHL isn't ready for this is because what we see small market teams occasionally go into the deep end. We saw the Blue Jackets mount up the offer they did for Johnny Gaudreau. We saw the Devils make the offer for Dougie Hamilton they did. I had mentioned Zach Werenski before. I mentioned Ivan Provorov before. When you are a team in a smaller market that doesn't have the gravitas to command free agent attention, you need to compensate for that. You need to pay more. And we have seen a laundry list of supporting cast guys go on to clear really big numbers in other markets where you think about the leap Barclay Goodrow made in salary going from the Lightning to the Rangers. The Rangers are a big market team, and they overcompensated for the sake of it because they felt like they could. That's what I'm talking about here. If everybody has money to throw around, it's going to be harder than ever to facilitate player movement. And I know that's kind of the antithesis of where I think the NHL is going in the aggregate, because I think the social expectations for players have changed to some degree. What's expected of them, both in terms of what they look for in terms of term, preferring those 3 or 4 year deals to the 7 or 8s. I think there's a real incentive there if you are a star player to do what Austin Matthews did, to take a 3 or a 4 year deal, re-rack, and then get another contract for 2 or 3 years by the time you're 31 or 32. And you will be out of your physical prime, but you should still be able to put up good counting stats, especially if you're an elite player, because elite players generally age more gracefully. There is just a lot to consider right now. And I don't know what to expect beyond stupidity. Because as much as we credit general managers for the challenges they face, it is a difficult job. We know these guys like to spend money. And I always say, when you go shopping for credibility on July 1st, you burn yours. If you're a middling team and you go out and sign a third or a fourth liner from a team that won a Stanley Cup under the justification, well, he won a Stanley Cup, he's going to bring valuable experience. One guy cannot import a culture from another place. Just because Barclay Goodrow played on those Lightning teams that won Stanley Cups as the 10th most important forward, that did not mean he was going to be able to import the Tampa Bay culture and the mindset that permeated that team to win 2 straight Stanley Cups into that Rangers locker room. I think anytime you start thinking in terms of buying something, that's where you're losing out. You want to buy goals and you want to buy saves. Goals are more expensive than saves, but saves are important. And real quick, I do think this is a good thing for small market teams, that they're going to have access to more capital, that money is going to be cheaper for them as far as doling it out, so players will be worth more going forward. I think that is a good thing for teams like the Wild to be able to keep their star players. I think there's a strong case Kirill Kaprizov will retire as the best player in the history of the Minnesota Wild franchise, should he play out the duration of this contract with the Wild. But we are going to take our second and final break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to relate this all the way back to the Oilers, all the way to Connor McDavid's potential, or maybe not so potential extension, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every single day. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Because right now, new FanDuel customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet. Put down $5, and if that bet hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use on the FanDuel app. I love using FanDuel because it makes however you want to play easy. If you don't want to bet the game and you just want to try player props, they got you. If you want to cook up a parlay for your friends to squad ride together, FanDuel's got you. Or if you're watching the game and you feel the momentum shifting in real time, live lines make it happen. So FanDuel has just one question. What are you waiting for? Tomorrow night, good game, important game in the early stages of the NFC West. The Rams, 5.5-point favorites hosting the 49ers. Then, really fun one in the NFC West, in the NFC West on Sunday afternoon, 4 o'clock on the East Coast. The Buccaneers heading up to Seattle to take on Sam Darnold. Baker Mayfield, your favorite quarterback's favorite quarterback. That's a good game. If you're ready, visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are making our way through the fleeting stages of the offseason, friends, and it's on the horizon. We will have real NHL hockey on our televisions next week. I am ecstatic that we will have games and results to talk about as opposed to forecasts and having philosophical discussions. Though I do enjoy these, don't get me wrong. My favorite type of conversations are the philosophical and the meta, but as far as the Oilers go, there is no more existential question than Connor McDavid's future. I think this deal tells us that it's not about decisions. It's not about money. It's not about years. I think the fact that McDavid has not signed yet is a really clear indication that he is struggling with the decision to make. I think there is a real sense of loyalty that he wants to win with his friends. He's been in Edmonton for 10 years now. McDavid's 28. He has spent almost half of his life in Edmonton as the most important player on this team. He is endearingly close with Leon Draisaitl, with Darnell Nurse, with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. He is connected beautifully on the ice with Zach Hyman. The Oilers employ his former junior coach as their coach. They employ his former agent as the president of hockey operations. They have acquired a litany of players over the years because of previous connections to McDavid at the junior hockey level. Everything about this organization is oriented around Connor McDavid and getting the most out of him. The question for Connor, as we have debated here all summer, is can he win a cup with the Oilers? What is the direction? How sustainable is this? And I have been pretty harsh about the long-term trajectory of this team because there is so much uncertainty. I have long maintained I think Connor is going to sign a short-term deal to stay in Edmonton. I think the Kaprizov extension only reinforces what we already know. McDavid will be the highest paid player in hockey whenever he signs, whether that is today, tomorrow, or June, or July 1st. That said, if the Oilers cannot get McDavid under contract, it is a failure. And it is a long-term failure to build the infrastructure around him to entice him to stay. Because the fact he hasn't come out and said, I want X, Y, and Z, I think we all know the Oilers are going to give him whatever he wants term and years-wise. It is simply a matter of getting him to sign. If you're trying to consider the factors as to why he might not sign, we know he wants to win. If the Oilers are not a reasonable chance of winning a Stanley Cup because of the long-term direction of the team, he is going to look out for his interests. But I think we are looking at an extremely awkward situation, one I do not envy any of the parties involved in. And I am hopeful, and this will be the last thing I get off before we call it an episode. I hope the Oilers do not try and whisper campaign Connor. I do not want to be a party to awkwardness and second and third hand reporting of, well, Connor thinks blah, 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 coming very, very nakedly from Oilers sourced people. I think anytime you start to try and wage a whisper campaign in the dark, especially about guys on your team, it's one thing if it's a coach or an executive, that's a little bit different. You cannot play chicken with Connor McDavid here. Because if you try and make him look like the bad guy, he will leave. If you try and make him look like the bad guy, the fan base is going to notice, and they are going to call you on that. This is the best player in the world. This is the best hockey player I personally have ever seen. This is someone who is as good as you can possibly conceive of. There are 30 NHL teams across the league that have never had a player this good in their history. You know, we're 100 years into the NHL. We're almost at 110 years next year. There are a lot of teams out there who have never had a player of this caliber. And if everybody has liquidity, it's not a matter of can you afford him. Then the inversion happens. Then it kind of becomes LeBron the summer he picked going to the Heat. Because if everybody has money, it doesn't become about money anymore. That's the irony of this. If everybody has money, it doesn't really matter anymore. You know, when a handful of teams are the big market spenders who acquire the marquee players, then it matters. But if everybody is flush with cash, if everybody can offer $18 million per year, then it becomes about the infrastructure, the logistics. Who do I get to play with? Who am I going to try and mature and bring along? Who's the next wave? And that's the undercurrent of a lot of this, at least to me. I think if Connor felt good about the long-term direction of the team, he would have signed already. I think the fact he has been very pointed in his remarks about wanting to win more than anything, and one of the keys to eventually breaking through and winning is having repeated chances, more than one, more than two, having 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cracks at playoff runs, and hoping you get the supporting cast right. The Oilers supporting cast is not set in stone beyond this year. You have free agents, both your goalies, Ekholm, Wallman. That's important. Adam Henrique's a free agent after this year. You have a lot of questions about where your team is going from here, and your most important players are all 30 other than Bouchard. They're all expensive on varying degrees of a sliding scale, and you have real questions to answer about where you go from here. And very clearly, Connor does not feel convinced about that. So with Kaprizov's deal as kind of the baseline of at least $17 million per year, the question becomes simple. How do you entice McDavid to stay? Because if he does not stay, the Oilers are starting over. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everybody that made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or over on YouTube. If you happen to be listening on Apple or Spotify, a 5-star review would be greatly appreciated. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.